Hi, my name is Gabby Higgins. I am one of the ESL teachers at West Middle School, and I'm going to be taking you through the first half of the ELP Standards Module 5 about formative assessments. On this slide, you will see our guiding questions for the module. And on this slide, you will see our objectives for the module. In this section of the module, we'll address one version of the formative assessment process and walk you through how to assess student language and learning using the ELP standards and level descriptors. We've done a lot with formative assessments in this district, so this slide is just a quick review, contrasting what the formative assessment process is with what it is not may help us paint a clear conceptual picture about what we're talking about. Another instructional component that is essential to formative assessment is scaffolding. Scaffolding, as defined in this module, is support or guidance provided to students that enables them to perform a particular task independently. Scaffolding should occur throughout formative assessment as it is temporarily supporting the development of students' content understandings as well as disciplinary and language practices. Formative assessment also allows for more focused and useful scaffolding as it provides more transparent information about what kind of language and thinking students are currently engaged in relation to your expectations. And importantly, English learners at all levels of proficiency should be provided with scaffolding in order to reach the next reasonable proficiency level as they develop grade-appropriate language capacities. These are the four components of the formative assessment process. These were originally presented by the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium and are as follows: clarify intended learning, elicit evidence, interpret evidence, and act on evidence. The first step is clarify intended learning. Educators and students identify the learning or language expectations, whether they take the form of goals, objectives, or something else. This is important so they can measure to what degree students met these expectations later in the formative assessment process. Effective expectations should consider how students are using the language to communicate their learning. One way to do this is to draw from the ELP standards and level descriptors to both create and refine expectations. The standards, since they address broader functional expectations for language, can be used as a starting point when clarifying expectations. For this example, on the slide here, we have selected standard 4 in the green. This standard is too broad to serve as a measurable objective for students. So, to craft a more concrete and specific objective, we can turn to the standard level descriptors for standard 4. Students at different levels of proficiency may meet the objective in slightly different ways. For example, if a student is performing at a level 2 for this standard, he may only be able to provide a simple claim and perhaps one reason to support it. But a student performing at a level 5 for oral or written argumentation may provide a more complex claim with logically ordered facts to serve as evidence. The standards provide guidance on what is appropriate given a student's particular skill level. The next component of the formative assessment process is elicit evidence of both learning and language use. Educators and students can elicit evidence using a variety of strategies. The type of evidence referred to in this module is evidence of student learning and language use, or more specifically, observable evidence of student learning and language use, meaning in order for something to be considered evidence, you have to be able to see, hear, or read it. The third component of the formative assessment process is interpreting evidence. To interpret evidence, educators examine what evidence is elicited and identify where students are in relation to the desired learning and language expectations. We are not just concerned with evidence of students' content learning, but also with evidence of students' language use as we aim to cultivate students' ability to develop and express their learning through language. Interpreting evidence of students' language use, however, is often easier said than done, even if you've considered language in your learning objectives. When interpreting evidence, it helps to think of a student learning and language use as occurring along a trajectory. This is where the ELP standards and level descriptors can be extremely useful, as trajectory is designed to help you interpret the evidence you've gathered of students expressing their content learning through conversations. The final attribute of the formative assessment process is act on evidence. When educators and students act on evidence, they use the information gleaned from interpreting the evidence to adjust teaching and learning and take actionable steps to meet the needs of students in the classroom. There are basically two ways to act on information gathered from your interpretation of the evidence. First, teachers can act on evidence by providing direct oral or written feedback to students. Second, educators may act on evidence by engaging in instructional responses or making instructional adjustments based on their interpretations. There are also two different times to act on evidence. You can either act upon the evidence in the moment, right after you've interpreted it, or you may act on the evidence after the fact, after you've reviewed and analyzed a particular piece or pieces of student evidence, like a conversation. In this case, you may act later in a lesson, during the next lesson, or across the span of a unit. Some important criteria to consider when attempting to act on evidence. Effective action needs to be evidence-based, meaning there needs to be clear, logical, and relatively direct links between the interpreted evidence and the action taken. Second, feedback and instructional adjustments need to consider where students are on relevant learning and language trajectories. And finally, effective formative action moves student learning forward or is actionable, meaning that the action is descriptive, specific, and provides students with concrete information upon which they can act themselves.
This is the second half of our PD on formative assessment and ELP standards. How can the English language proficiency standards be used throughout formative assessment to plan and inform instruction? The purpose of this section is to address the second guiding question of the module. How can the English language proficiency standards be used throughout formative assessment to inform and plan? In previous modules, we've engaged in several aspects of the formative assessment process. We will continue to do so. One important component of clarifying intended learning, particularly if you are working with pre-written task or curriculum, is to analyze the learning task or lesson in order to understand the demands of the task, so that you can clarify what students should know and be able to do at the end of the task. For example, we can use the ELP Standard 3 for grades 9 through 12 to illustrate how we can draw from a particular standard when crafting a learning objective. ELP Standard 3 states that a student can speak and write about grade-appropriate complex literary and informal texts and topics. So let's suppose that you are working with a high school history student on delivering oral presentations about the causes of World War II. By drawing from Standard 3 and the descriptors, we can craft the following learning objective for this task. Students will be able to deliver grade-appropriate oral presentations about the causes of World War II using information and historical documents. Once we have clarified the intended learnings for ourselves, the next step is to clearly articulate these learnings and language expectations to the students. We also need to consider how to scaffold the objectives so students performing at different levels of English language proficiency with respect to the standard. Although it is important to maintain the same learning expectations for all students, we must also keep in mind that students at varying English language proficiency might need to demonstrate their learning differently. This is where our DI instruction is very important. As teachers, you elicit evidence all the time in your classroom. So the focus here is how we can use the ELP standard to pinpoint the type of evidence you need in order to determine how your students are progressing towards your expectations. The ELP standards can be organized in this alternate way according to the modalities they address, or in relation to the domains of listening, speaking, reading, and writing. This alternate organization can be a helpful tool when preparing to elicit evidence, namely by knowing which domains of language a standard emphasizes. We can determine what form of evidence to collect from our students. We can further refine the type of evidence to collect by looking at the standards level descriptors associated with the standards. For Standard 3, the spoken evidence might be the form of an oral presentation, and the written evidence might be the form of a written narrative or informational text. The type of evidence should be informed by the expectations we articulated when we clarified the intended learning and language use for the students. So again, remember that to interpret evidence of student learning is to figure out where the students are along the learning and language trajectory in relation to our expectations. To this end, the ELP standards are an extremely useful tool for delineating the progression students follow when using language, both in the form of function to accomplish content-specific tasks. So, interpreting evidence using the standards, PLDs, can help us understand where students are in relation to our language and learning expectations, and to identify areas for additional support. Let's examine how the standards level descriptors describe a learning and language trajectory for students. For Standard 3, in the domain of speaking, the learning progression ranges from delivering short oral presentations about a familiar topic with support at Level 2, to determine oral presentations about a variety of topics using fully developed examples for a Level 5. For the domain of writing, the progression follows a similar trajectory. Interpreting students' language output using the PLDs provides us with concrete information on which to base our decision about instructional steps. As a quick review, the two ways to act on evidence include providing feedback to students and making instructional adjustments. The ELP standards can be a useful source for either of these actions. The standards, PLDs, also can be used to provide specific feedback tied to our learning and language expectations. For example, if we found that many students performed at a Level 2 with respect to Standard 3, we can use the descriptors under Level 3 to inform the feedback the students to give. In this case, we might suggest to students that they develop the topic with a few details in their writing or oral presentation, thus moving them forward along the trajectory for this standard. There is a video attached to this PD training. If you wish to view it, you will have to go into online, open up a browser, and type it in. Always, if you have any questions about this training, PD, you can find information at the www.elpa21.org. There's also information in Canvas. With the completion of this PD, we'll ask you to fill out the 321 exit ticket found in your assignments in Canvas. Once you have done this, your name will be recorded and sent to the state as completing the Module 5 PD. Thank you.